Hi everyone, and welcome to another Heroes and Bosses video. This video will focus primarily on some of the techniques I use for painting bones and rust. Here are the original skeletons, and as you can see, they're in desperate need of mold line removal. A buddy of mine, Adam, said he finally wanted to try painting miniatures and came over for a weekend. Here he is over in the corner. So these are the miniatures I'll be using to show some of the basics of painting. We're starting off by priming the skeletons in skeleton bone from Army Painter. If you don't have this color, white would also work fine. As I go through the video, I'll be placing Adam's skeletons on the left and mine on the right, so you can see if he's doing a good job. No pressure, right? Next, we're using skeleton bone paint to make sure all of the bones are covered. Use an old brush for this, since you want to mash it into the ribs and the eye sockets. Once you're happy that the entire skeleton is covered, let it dry and move on to the first wash. So far so good. Now earlier I showed two different washes. For the skeletons I'll be using Agrax Earthshade Gloss, and I find this preferable to normal Agrax on skeletons for a couple of reasons. First of all, the glossy wash doesn't stick as well to other paints as normal Agrax Earthshade. This means it won't stain the original color as much. The second reason is that because it doesn't stick as well, it pools more heavily in recesses. This is great for skeletons since you want it to look like the gaps are empty spaces or holes through the figure. This part was sped up slightly because I wanted to show the whole process. Next, I'm using a damp brush to remove excess wash, pretty much like you would if you're using a quick shade. So already these guys are looking 10 times better. After letting them dry, the next step is to follow up with 2 layers of dry brushing. We're going to start off with some Screaming Skull, but going right back to the original skeleton bone is fine too. These two colors are nearly identical. When doing the dry brushing, you don't want to move the brush in every direction. Move your brush downwards so that the upturned surfaces receive the paint. The only time you don't want to do this is if your brush is running parallel to the grooves or recesses in the miniature, like in the fingers or the toes. In situations like that, move your brush perpendicular to the raised edges. Basically, you're trying to avoid getting paint into the darkened areas. I'm also focusing my paint on the top of the head and the shoulders. There aren't any shadows there, but I want to brighten them up anyway since they would be lit up from an overhead light source. Next, we're going to be doing the exact same thing again, but this time using a 1-to-1 mix of Ivory and Screaming Skull. This will be a much lighter dry brush, and will only really focus on the parts we want to stand out the most. So here you can see I'm concentrating on the facial features. I'm also going to focus on the fingers, the toes, and the top of the head. Next, we're going to be painting the blades and the handles of the scythes. I'm going with Mournfang Brown for the handles. Adam decided to go with Dryad Bark and Steel Legion Drab. Now, it's a good thing I'm doing voiceover, because at this point Adam is cursing up a storm after he hit the fingers of a skeleton with brown paint. For the metal blade, we're going to be using pig iron from P3, though any metal color will do since a lot of this is going to be covered in rust later. Here's a progress picture. You can see Adam went a bit heavier with the dry brushing, so his skeletons are a bit brighter, mine look a bit dirtier. Next, we're going to use Agrax Earthshade on the handle of the scythe. This is to re-establish some of the shadows that got covered up when we applied the brown. I'm covering the entire handle, but I'm making sure there's extra shade around the hands and any place the handle is touching another material. For the blade, I'm only applying Nuln Oil wash in 2 places. The The first is along the edge of the blade. Secondly, I'm putting a small amount on the back of the blade to emphasize where it curves inward. You could of course cover the entire blade, but that's not really necessary. The handle is going to receive a basic highlight using two colors. The first is a reapplication of the original Mournfang Brown. My paint is quite watered down, and I'm making sure to brush from the darkest point to the lightest. I try to ignore the dark patches on the blade. I got ahead of myself. The next highlight color is a 50-50 mix of Mournfang Brown and XV88, and I'm just painting the foremost surface of the handle. Now it's time for the rust. For this we'll be using 3 colors plus a little silver for edge highlighting. I'm starting off with Typhus Corrosion. I'm just putting this where I think the most rust would accumulate. If the blade was still being used, then most of the rust would be at the top of the blade. So I'm just smearing this around in a random pattern, trying not to let it pool too heavily, though maybe you want a super rusty looking blade. If so, go ahead and cover up most of the metal paint. After that's completely dry, it's time to use the first rust color, Mournfang Brown. This color is a reddish brown, the kind of color you'd find in damp, pitted rust. I'm just dry brushing this into the Typhus Corrosion. The Typhus paint is slightly textured, so it will easily pick up other colors. Next I'm using the second rust color, Ryza Rust. Now I want a subtle rusty color, so I'm using this sparingly, but if you want the blade to look really old, then use more of the Ryza Rust. Next I'm going to do an edge highlight with shining silver, just tracing out the sharp edges of the blade. Now I'm adding a few chipped spots in the rust where the blade might have struck something and the rust was scraped off. Now for the base we'll be using 3 colors. I'm mixing a color to match the colorful squares of the HeroQuest game board. So my main color will be a 2-to-1 mix of Mechanicus Standard Gray and Stegadon Scale Green. Next, I'm going to edge highlight all around the base by dry brushing with Celestra Gray. And finally, I'm going to paint on black lines to make the base look like tiles, roughly the same size as the game board. And this is the final step before applying Testors Dullcote as the matte varnish. You can see Adam smudged his base just a little bit, but he said he wanted to leave it that way as a reminder that this was the first miniature he ever painted. So here are the finished products, ready for some 90s board game action. Special thanks to all my patrons for supporting these videos. I hope you found this video useful, or at least entertaining, and thank you for watching.